Okay, the next tool we're going to cover for safety is the bandsaw. Like the table saw, the joiner, the margin of safety for the bandsaw is 6 inches. It says that right on here. Next rule you'd have is the safety valve. On the top here, this part of the bandsaw is called the upper blade guide. It's called that because it's on top. There's also a lower blade guide. What they're going to do is they're going to keep the blade from excessive twisting or getting pulled around on there. So having this down does two purposes. It keeps you safer because there's less risk of you getting a hand cut in here, but it also gives you a better quality cut. So lower the upper blade guide, unscrew that, just drop it on the material you're going to cut. It's on the side here. And then I just lift it up a hair, tighten it up. This should be no higher than 1/4 of an inch above that, which is about like a pencil. But if you drop it right on top and lift it up, that's an easier, safer way to do it. You get a good cut out of it. So the bandsaw can do almost any cut that a table saw can, except for it always has to cut through. So a table saw can do a groove. The bandsaw is not going to be able to cut a groove in this simply because it's too tall. The thing that a bandsaw does really, really well is it cuts curves. The way you want to cut a curve, say I have a curve right here that's been drawn. There are two ways you can cut that curve. First one is I can feed into the saw and I can make several passes. So I cut that block off, cut another one here, cut another one there, continue to make pass after pass. The other way that I would recommend is to make what's called a relief cut, also called a release cut sometimes. So I've got an arc there, and I'm going to cut straight in and straight out. The big danger you have on the bandsaw is that you would pull the blade off. While you're cutting a curve, if you back out of a curve cut, you can pull the blade actually off of the wheels that are up top here. If those wheels, if they come off the wheels, then you've got maybe some damaged material, maybe even an injury if you're not careful. So, 6-inch margin of safety on here again. You can back out of shortcuts. You cannot back out of long cuts. So I'll do this curve first. A little light here.
Oh.
Here it is. Straight in and straight out. I want to cut just off the line. I'll use the sander later on to get through there. Instead of using my hand here to steer, I'm going to use a hook stick. I'll get you started. The relief cuts allow me to back out of there now. Now I've got my basic arc there. I could go back and get a little bit closer probably, just cutting that relatively quickly. The other cut that a bandsaw is special in what it can do and what it does well. Because the bandsaw blade is so thin, we can do what's called resawing. And resawing is when you take a board and set it on edge and actually cut down to make two thinner boards. And no other tool does that as well as a bandsaw because the blade is so thin. Table saw takes a very wide cut. Bandsaw does a really good job.
They also snap.
What was that?
Some blades, they
Yep.
snap.
If you twist it too hard, or if you try to back out of a curve, you could snap the blade. And if you hear a clicking sound, that indicates you need to stop because the blade may have a crack in it. If I had a cut that looked like this, like that, I would be better off to cut this short cut first and back out of that, rather than cut a very long cut, back out of the long cut, and then make my short cut. So shortcuts first, long cuts last. 6-inch margin of safety. Whatever you're cutting has to be tight against the table as you're working. So for that reason, if I had a dowel, this is never going to be flat against the table. So I cannot cut it like this. In order to cut this, I need to have a block with a V notch in it that would hold it steady while I went through. Or I could hold it with a clamp, not a pair of pliers, but a clamp, and run that through. You can also use a miter gauge with that slot. Bandsaw can also be used to cut bevel cuts by tilting the table. You tilt it to the angle you'd like. The way I'd recommend getting your angle, using the chop saw, I'd cut a board at the angle you want, and then use it as a gauge. It's a very small board. And I could use that. Okay, so that fits nice right there. Tighten it up. And still set my upper blade guide at the height that I want. It's a little tricky when you're sitting on an angle. I can still do it. You can listen to it and hear it going too fast. If you hear it fighting you, then you know you're going too quick. So there I've got an angled arc. So the key thing on the bandsaw is listening to it. If it sounds like you're twisting the blade, don't abuse it quite so much. Getting it back to square, you can try to use the square. The easiest way to do it, again though, that same trick we used on the table saw. Cut through and see if you flip one side over, if they line up. Doesn't take long, and usually the bandsaw is set at 90 degrees, but just to make sure. No, we're off right. Close. The injury that I had happened when someone came over and they flicked a piece out to get it out of the way of the blade. And when they flicked it, the blade caught their finger and drew their finger in, and it cut up into their fingernail. It was nasty. So you want to make sure that when you leave, the machine is off, and you also make sure that when you're clearing chips out, don't use your fingers. Use a pencil, a chip brush, another stick, something like that. Those fit up there before. I'm pretty close to 90 right now. The marks left by the bandsaw are going to have to be sanded off. So it is not as straight and it is not as controlled as the table saw, but it does a good job cutting marks. Questions in the bandsaw? Yes.
For curves, you said there was two kinds of cuts. One was relief, and one was the other one.
I don't know what I'd call that one. Just kind of making several passes. Relief cuts is what I would prefer you use for curves.
And you cut a board, how thick would be the gap?
How thick will the gap between the blade leaves?
Yeah, how thick would the gap be?
These blades are probably less than a 16th of an inch. So, as far as the size of piece that you need to have, your fingers have to be 6 inches away. If it's smaller than 6 inches, like this piece, it's a clamp. You mean the gap, the curve left by the blade?
Yeah.
Less than a 16th of an inch. Anytime I'm making a cut and there is like I cut in part way, what I'm leaving is called a kerf, K-E-R-F. And that saw kerf is wider with a table saw. It's going to be thinner with a bandsaw.